Hello. First, of course, I want to say thank you so much for having me today. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. Look at the size of this crowd. This may actually be my biggest ever. So I always like to start with a story of a time when I was living in Naples, Florida, which is, if you're unfamiliar, down on the southwest coast of Florida. And it was shortly after college, and I decided to move there because I was interested in leaving Washington, D.C. to get out of my comfort zone. And it's a very small coastal town, and at the time I lived there, I was the only deaf resident. All of my friends and all of my acquaintances were all hearing. The closest deaf person to me was a few hours away by car, and most people I had met in the town had never really met another deaf person. So it was just me and all of my friends who could hear. Lucky for me, Naples, Florida is actually home to some really phenomenal volleyball players, some Olympians who live and train there through the year. So I would play with them all the time, whether inside or outside, and I have to say, they were pretty lucky because I'm pretty good at volleyball. So we'd play as much as we could through the year, whether it was inside or out on the beach, and I wanted to take a year off, so I wasn't really working. So one night, after a game, we had been playing most of the day, a good friend and I pull up some chairs by the beach. And at that time, I was 24, and he asked me a question that in 24 years of my life, I had never heard before. Completely blew my mind. And he asked me, have you ever wished that you could hear? And I thought to myself, why would you ask me that? And then I thought and realized, while we were sitting there on the beach, I could see the waves crashing on the ocean, or on the shore, but he could hear them. I couldn't. To our left, people had taken over the volleyball court and were playing and cheering each other on. To our right, there was a family with a baby and a mother was playing and cooing. And behind us, cars and ATVs had passed by virtually all day, and I had heard nothing, because my world is completely silent. So of course I was quick to answer and say no. Of course not. I've never once wished that I could hear, because I love being deaf. And I cherish my deaf identity for a multitude of reasons, but mostly my culture. My experiences are much different than many of you hearing people in this room. I use another language, making me bilingual now. And growing up, my experiences and my perspective on the world and in my life were much different than all of you. So of course I cherish who I am, and I would never want to change that. For example, imagine if I were to go into a job interview with a panel of hearing peers. If I was the only one deaf in the room, in the back of my mind, if I'm wishing that I could hear, if I was wishing that I could speak to them the same way that they'll speak to me, at that same level, do you think I would do very well? Do you think I'd get the job? No way, right? Because in the back of my mind, I'm focusing on the negative. That negative mindset sets up a negative outcome. But instead, if I choose to look at my identity and my difference as an advantage and not a deficit, I can go into that room and explain to them for a myriad of reasons why that company should hire me and how they can benefit from having a deaf man in the room at the table with them. And I know I would get that job, right? And I also think, when I think back to the beach, I also think of other reasons why I've learned to love myself. Now, many of you may not realize that my entire family is deaf. My two older brothers, my parents, my grandparents, and even my great-grandparents. I'm the fourth generation in a beautiful deaf family with over 25 members. And much like you hearing people, if you were to imagine growing up with hearing parents, you simply didn't see barriers that weren't there. You had normal communication, access to language in your home. It was the same in my house. My entire family's deaf. It was a utopia for me in every way. So growing up, my parents already knew to give me sign language and to put me in a deaf school. So I had a really normal childhood. And I was very thankful to be given my deaf identity from day one of my existence. So many of you may think because my entire family is deaf, my house is probably really quiet, right? No. Let me tell you, we don't know how much noise we actually make So it's loud. We're doing dishes, we're banging doors, we're yelling. It's crazy, I promise. If any of you want to come over for dinner, you're gonna leave with a headache. So coming from a deaf family was really big and a strong support of my identity. But another thing that really taught me who I am is my parents when they put me into a deaf school, right? They, of course, put me in an environment that was designed for a deaf person to learn and thrive and grow. But mind you, it was the 90s when I went to school, right? And I went to a small school in New York City in Queens. And their program at that time was really, really not in great shape. It was all run by hearing people. My teachers couldn't really sign that well. They weren't fluent in the language that I used at home. And so it was tough to understand. You know, a lot of times they would use broken ASL or just fragmented language. And if I would ask a question, they would always ask me to repeat or to sign really slowly and super clear. And to me, that didn't make much sense. All of my peers didn't really know sign language either. Even though they were deaf, they hadn't had the language exposure that I had coming from a deaf family. Their parents could all hear. So it was a really tough environment for me. And every time I would go into math class, I would always get pulled out to speech therapy, right? So I'd have to go to a speech lesson for 30 minutes just to learn how to pronounce the letter B. Imagine, B, B, B. For 30 minutes while all my peers are learning math and they're growing and they're doing fun stuff in the classroom. And I just felt stuck. So my mother, of course, is not only a strong deaf woman, but a strong advocate, and saw that my education was lacking. So she approached the school board. She presented them with a letter and said, you need to empower deaf educators to be decision makers. And she gave them a list of demands to support the next generation of deaf children coming through that school, to provide an inclusive environment, advocating for those kids, to give them the best quality of education, and to build an environment where they could thrive. My parents are deaf. They knew what we needed. So of course, it was an entire hearing administration, and they thought, well, deaf people don't know the best for deaf people, and they didn't want to empower us. So my mother, furious, decided, you know what, that's it. And she packed our bags, and we moved out of state. She moved us to Texas so that I could go to one of the best deaf schools in the nation. And I remember on my first day going into school, it was complete culture shock. Everyone was deaf. Everyone could sign like me, students, teachers, the faculty, even the superintendent. And I realized that that was an environment where I would thrive. And I thought, oh, finally, I can love myself as a deaf person, and I don't have to think about being deaf. It's not a barrier to me anymore. I could play sports, and I helped win a lot of basketball games. There were so many different organizations that I got involved in and could really enjoy my time there. And the funny thing is, growing up, I always wanted to teach math. It was my passion, because obviously, like many of you, I had some math teachers that seriously sucked. So, of course, being in those classes, I always wanted to become a better math teacher than the ones that I have. And maybe you aren't familiar, but I went to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. It's the only entirely deaf university in the world, where I gained 2 degrees, once in education and also mathematics. But right after graduation, America's Next Top Model hit me up on Instagram, and they said, we thought you're really hot, you should be on this show. And I thought, well, that's a scam. There's no way they want me on this show. But they kept bugging me, sliding into my DMs. And so I thought, maybe this is legit. So I decided I'd give it a chance. And I ended up on the show. And again, it was a second experience where, you know, it was the second time in my life where I was living with an entire group of hearing people. It was a challenge. But the funny thing is, during the confessionals that they would ask us to do for the show, they would always put us one-on-one with an interviewer. And they would ask the same thing, how hard is it to be deaf? Were you bullied as a child? What was growing up life? It was sad, right? It was sad, you're deaf. And I was like, no. I thought it was funny because I was like, no, it's actually really easy to be deaf, especially in my house. You know, there were a lot of advantages to being a deaf person. You know, and certainly during that process, I always kept in the back of my mind, like, you know, I love myself as a deaf person. And I wasn't sure why people were trying to convince me otherwise. I felt strong in my identity. And I was strong in my identity because I was introduced to my community where I could learn and where I could grow and where I could thrive. And I was supported in my community, whether by my parents or my peers. And that taught me to love myself and to embrace my identity. But at the same time, I also learned to recognize my difference. and realized that there was always an identity in the back of my mind that I failed to address because I hadn't found another community that I belonged in. And during that process was when I realized to come out not only as a deaf person, but also as a member of the LGBTQ community. And many people, wondered if that was really me, if that was really the identity that had been there all along. And I'm telling you, finding my community and finding my home is what taught me to not only embrace that identity, but live it authentically. And I realized that those two identities, not only do they intersect, being deaf and also being a queer person, or being a member of the LGBT community, but it helped me to live my life as the most authentic Niall I could be. All of the successes that I had imagined were possible if I simply owned my identity as a deaf person and as a queer person. If I had never addressed those identities and if I had never accepted them and lived authentically, I wouldn't be standing here with you. So my message is always to use your identity and to use your difference as an asset and to live as authentic as you can and to go as far as you can with your community support behind you. And of course, before I wrap up, I always want to teach two very simple but important signs. The first is love. Do it with me. And the second is yourself. With me? Love yourself. And now third time on your own, let's see it. Beautiful. I give you all A pluses all around. Thank you.